So we want to think about, as we listen to these different stories, we want to think about how we ourselves could apply what they're saying, what they're talking about, to our own work, to our own world, okay? So first we're going to hear some strategies to deal with questions about your effectiveness that sound like, so what? How valuable is your work economically? So presenting these stories, we have with us Glynn Tonsor, agricultural economist with Kansas State University. He's going to lead off this set.
So I was going to try to impress on you three quick messages. So economists are often asked to quantify the so what, right? So what's the net benefit of a policy or avoiding damage and so forth? And I want to give you one example of where we've done that, and I think it applies to translate here. 3 times in a row, I'm going to just cite a paper. You can look at the paper later. That's not the point of this. But we have an E. coli vaccine in existence. So we have the ability to mitigate shedding of E. coli in the beef industry if at the feedlot stage we use a vaccine. So the science is there, and that's a tool in the toolbox, if you like, to mitigate E. coli risk. There's not a question of technical feasibility because it exists. We've developed it. But there's not a current incentive for the decision maker, who's the one that owns the animals at that point in time, to use the vaccine. So we have a handle on the cost of using the vaccine, right? What do you got to pay to procure it, handle the animals, administer it, and so forth. But we have no handle on what the benefit is in a broader social sense of that, investment, the return on investment for society. I can real quickly tell you what it is for that producer, whether they get anything different on their operations, pretty straightforward. But what's the broader social value of less E. coli risk is hard to answer. So here's a paper where Ted Schroeder, fellow economist at K-State, and I kind of tackled this, and I just want to kind of illustrate how you can add value to the so what, even if we don't have all the numbers we need. So in this situation, I have a handle on the cost to do something, right? Buy the vaccine and use it, and I really don't have good information on the benefits. And I sort of need to get a handle around the benefits to convince somebody, right, this is worth doing. So you can use the cost information, start presuming likely adoption paths in some policy scenario, like over 10 years we start mandating it, for an example, or packers start paying premiums and we bait people into using it and so forth. And you can back out, in econ speak, how much of a consumer demand benefit, i.e. they think beef is safer so they'll buy more and pay more, is needed to be an economic carrot to pull that adoption into place, or how much packer food safety cost reallocation could occur. So if instead of doing something in the plant today, I get somebody that owns the live animals to do something, I could shift my resources as a packer and still get the same safety outcome. So you can get safety benefits a different way. So you can quantify those potential benefits and then go to the decision maker and say, do we think it's likely that that'll occur? So in other words, you don't really observe the benefits, you identify the benefits that would be needed for there to be a net gain of us doing something. This is what I mean by backing into it. So you build scenarios to where if this occurred, you'd have a net benefit cost. Do we think that scenario will play out? Do we think consumers will pay more? Do we think we'll have packer cost savings and things like that? Those are easier to answer than how much are the packer cost savings, how much more will consumers pay? So what I'm really trying to highlight here is we can add value even if you know half of the equation. If you know cost but not benefits, you can give context on the threshold decision point, even if you don't know the exact benefit. The exact same thing holds on biosecurity is the point. Okay. The second comment, and this actually is some of Mike Sanderson's work with some of my partners in crime from K-State, is economics has a role in multidisciplinary assessment of how we respond to a disease. So this is a paper that Mike and some other economists at K-State have worked on, where in short, disease information is married up with economic models to guide how to respond in the case of FMD. This is mainly a point on the so what, is if you ignore economics or you ignore disease spread science, you're going to get different answers. But if you consider both of those, you will alter the recommended plan, and there's notable cost savings both to the government and to the production sector if we consider both the economic market adjustments as well as some of the public animal health regulatory realities, what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. So my only point here is if you include economics, you often get a different policy solution than if you ignore economics. But the same is true the other way. If you let economic gurus like me go work on it, but we don't have the bench science in our work, you're going to get different answers too. Neither one of those is optimal on these sticky topics. They are multidisciplinary by definition, and we all need to remember that. So the so what is we all have a role, is the point in that comment. The third thing here, and I will wrap this up because I know I'm getting Tim's time, is private and public incentives are very different. And that certainly holds for biosecurity. So most of us are in this room because we think in a broader sense society has something to be gained by us mitigating disease risk. That doesn't mean every individual stakeholder has the same benefit cost situation. And the trigger for a public action is driven by social benefit cost comparisons. The trigger for each of us individually usually is an individualized benefit cost comparison. And in the space of livestock, I want to give you a specific example to drive this home. It's pretty rational to me why we have partial adoption of animal identification and traceability in the beef industry, because for some beef producers, the benefit cost is such it's not worth it for them to participate, despite the fact that the industry collectively would probably be better off if we had all cattle in a system. That's really what this paper is about. And to give you a specific example to drive that home, if we retained beef exports to South Korea, in aggregate, that would cover the cost of having a national animal ID system in place. But notice I said in aggregate, and that's a very big if we keep South Korea. That's the big economic benefit of not losing a market. But when you dissect it in terms of the individual benefit cost for cow-calf producer A versus B, or cow-calf producers versus feedlots and so forth, there's a segment of the industry that individually still is worse off if you have a mandatory system. That's very important to remember. The private versus public benefit cost answers are different. Biosecurity is no different. We have that challenge. So somehow we have to work on either cost share or those kind of things to change the benefit cost for those that don't have a direct individual incentive to participate. There's lots of policies you could think about doing that, but we have to recognize that gap, and it's very common in these kind of forums that we think just the public benefits exceed the cost, so why aren't we doing more? We need to remember the individual decision makers, whether it's deciding whether to use soap or not in the barn or invest in ID or whatever. Their individual benefit cost assessments are very important to remember.